Okay, in this video I'm going to go over Hsrp, which is Hot Standby Router Protocol. Hsrp is under the class of First Hop Redundancy Protocols, or FHRPs. Other examples of FHRPs are Gateway Load Balance Protocol and Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol. It uses UDP on port 1985, and it has the following router functions with assigned IP addresses. There's the forwarding router, the virtual router, and the standby router. So the standby router basically just acts as a backup for the forwarding router. So if anything happens to the forwarding router, which is the main router that does all the functions, then the standby router can swoop in, kind of go behind the virtual router and do all the functions for things sent to the virtual router, and help replace the forwarding router that might be broken or disconnected. So this provides fault tolerance. So what exactly does that mean by fault tolerance? Well, let's say we had a network that just had a single router. So if this router goes away, loses connection, or breaks, then suddenly our entire network doesn't have connection to the outside world. But if it has a standby router, then this standby router can swoop in and quickly be a fix. So this is what fault tolerance is. The network can tolerate something going wrong. So there's two timers you need to know, the hello timer and the standby timer. The hello timer is sent by the forwarding router every 3 seconds just to the standby router saying hello and letting it know that it exists. The standby timer is the amount of time that the standby router will wait until it gets concerned that it hasn't gotten a hello message, and it'll become the new active router. It'll say something must be wrong, so I'm going to become the new active router. Now priority is at default 100, which it's just a value that's assigned to a router, and the router with the highest priority can become the active one. This is when Hsrp is first being set up. Because by default they're 100, sometimes you can't decide. So in this case, the first device will automatically become active. And if you have two devices that are already set up, and they set up their connection after already being set up with Hsrp, then the one, and they have the same priority, so they both are become active essentially at the same time, then the one with the higher IP address will become the active router. So that's a whole hierarchy of what decides which router becomes the active one. Okay, then we have the preemption. So preemption is a setting that allows the router with a higher priority to interrupt the active router while that router is speaking. So usually if we have an active router, another one becomes the backup router, or is the standby router. The standby router, even if it has higher priority, can't interrupt the active router to become the active router. So preemption allows it to do this. So if there's a router that you really want to be the active router, as soon as it is active and as soon as it is connected to the network, then you would want that to have preemption. So that if it's a standby router, it can become the active router. Then just know the virtual router has a MAC address of 0000.0c07.acxx, where XX represents the group number, which you'll see later, but it's just the group number for our standby group. Okay, now we're going to set up our routers. I'm just going to go ahead and set up a network. We'll have a switch to connect everything. I'll set up my hosts and assign them just somewhat random IP address. And then the default gateway isn't going to be a random IP address. This is going to be the IP address of our virtual router. And that'll make sense later. Well, essentially, it's going to be the virtual router because the virtual router is going to be what can be set up as the reliable router that will stay. So if either router fails, the virtual router will still be there. So that's why I want the virtual router to be the default gateway. Okay, set up both the interfaces. Okay, now that we have all the interfaces set up, we can start setting up HSRP. So, how we're going to set up HSRP is standby, then our group number, which can be any number between 0 and 4096, and we'll say IP 192.168.1.1, which is the IP address of our virtual router. And then we'll say we will do show standby brief, and we'll see it's speaking. Our router is learning about the network, and now it has become active because it is the only router, it is the one that can become active. So we can look again, and we have our router is active, but we still don't know what the standby router is. I'll show you one more thing. If you remember the MAC address that I was talking about earlier, we can see that now with the group 1. And we can see our virtual IP address is 192.168.1.1. All right. Now I can leave here and go to the other router. And we'll set it up in the other router. We can say and now we'll see what's going on with show standby brief. It's listening, speaking. It now knows what the active router is. And now it has become the standby router. Let's say we didn't want this to be the standby router. We wanted this to be the active router. How can we change that? Well, I guess the first thing to come to mind is to change the priority. So let's try that. Automatically it's 100. Let's make it higher. Let's make it 105. Doesn't change anything immediately. In fact, it's still the standby. So what do we need to do? We need to do preemption. We do standby 1, preempt. And this will allow it to interrupt the active router and become the new active router. And pretty soon, boom, it's the active router now. And if we check, do show standby brief, we have it being the active router. So we can go ahead and change it back to we can go over to this router. And notice that this router is now in the state standby. So this router has flipped from being in an active state to being in a standby state. Okay, perfect. Now, let's go to the purpose of HSRP in general. Since this is the active router, let's say something happens to it. We won't delete it, but we'll just cut the line. Now this was the standby router. Let's just wait and see if something happens. Boom. I didn't press anything, but suddenly the other router that was in standby has gone from standby to active. So now it is in charge. It is the active router, and it is taking on that role of doing all of the things that the default gateway needs to do. So that is how HSRP works. I hope you have good luck configuring it on your own. Thanks.